Hi, hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Cynthia if you are new here. And first of all, Happy New Year's. We are in 2025. We made it. Being honest, I've been fairly quiet over the last month or so just because the holidays were busy and then New Year's kind of gave me a lot of anxiety. I wanted to be really hopeful for this year, but we all know what's going on in the world right now. So I'm just trying to keep my head above water like everyone else. And if you are someone who is going through it right now, please know that you are not alone. But with that being said, I did finally want to talk about my favorite books of 2024. I will preface this by saying that 2024 was a really struggle bus year of reading for me. I read 27 books, which is almost half the amount of books I read in 2023, so definitely did not read as much as I initially hoped. I definitely changed my reading goals several times throughout the year, but we're not going to talk about that. But of the 27 books I read, the majority of them were fantasy romance, so all of my favorite books of 2024 are in the fantasy romance genre, so if that's not your forte, that's fine. Feel free to click off. But if you do like fantasy romance, stick around and let's yap about the books that I enjoyed in 2024. The first book on the list, and I think possibly one of my favorite reads of 2024, is A Fate Inked in Blood by Daniel L. Jensen. So if you're not familiar, in A Fate Inked in Blood we meet our main character Freya, who is in a less desirable marriage. She really doesn't like her husband, and to be fair to Freya, her husband doesn't really like her either. And one day when she decides that she's had enough, she's got to get rid of this husband. She's had enough, she's fed up. Fate steps in and her husband, only in the name of marriage, betrays her, sending Freya on an epic journey as a shield maiden as she tries to help. Cannot remember his name. Essentially, he just wants to be king. He wants to steal the crown, be king, and he's going to use Freya to get what he wants. Is the overarching plot of this story, but there is also a very slow burn romance, another unwanted marriage, which was very unfortunate for Freya, but it didn't really play that big of a role, in my opinion, in this story. This book is kind of heavy, sorry. This was my first introduction to Daniel L. Jensen, and it did not disappoint. I had the Bridge Kingdom series bookmarked on Kindle Unlimited for quite a while, and I just never got around to reading them, and now they're not on Kindle Unlimited anymore, and I missed my opportunity. So I do have a copy of the first book on my bookshelf, and I do plan to read that this year, probably after Onyx Storm and the recovery that's going to follow, because Rebecca Yarros said she's going to hurt our feelings, and trying to prepare for that. I do plan to read that series as well, and I'm very excited for the sequel of this book to come out later this year, so very, very good. I very much enjoyed it, and if you haven't read this book, I definitely recommend reading this book. And the next book we have on the list, which could probably rival A Fate Inked in Blood for how much I enjoyed it, is Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. This book took me by such surprise because I went into this book blind. I sampled it on Libby through my library, decided that I really liked the narrator and the piece of the story that I heard sounded really interesting, and so I borrowed it. And as they say, the rest was history. But in Heartless Hunter, we meet our main character, Rune, and she's essentially living this double life. By day, she pretends to be this vapid socialite, and by night, she is the Crimson Moth, who is like this witch vigilante. And she's pretty bad. We like her. We like both sides of her. And on top of that, she is playing cat and mouse with the biggest witch hunter in the area. My words are not wording right now very well, I apologize. But she's also in this will they won't they courtship friendship thing with someone else. It's a very weird love triangle. They are brothers. I don't want to get too into it without spoiling it, and I will die on this hill that Kristen Ciccarelli, that is not how you end a love triangle. It's just not. Let's not do that again. But essentially, Rune is wearing a lot of different hats, and you're rooting for her and you want what's best for her, and the ending of this book is a major cliffhanger, but it still haunts me to this day, and I still have not stopped thinking about it. I think about the ending of this book a lot more than I probably should. If you haven't read this book, just like I said with A Fate Inked in Blood, go get a copy because this book also has a sequel coming out later this year. So unlike the first two books, Heartless Hunter and A Fate Inked in Blood, which are the first books in those series, the next book up on the list is Wisteria by Adeline Grace, and Wisteria is the third book in the Belladonna series. It also finishes out the trilogy for this series. If you're not familiar with the first two books, this probably isn't going to make a lot of sense, so I apologize. Feel free to skip ahead 30 seconds or just listen to me badly explain another book. In Wisteria, we focus on Blythe and Eris. Blythe believes that she has ties to Life, who was Eris's first wife, who death obviously took because because life ends for all of us. And so while Eris is trying to untangle the truth, he ends up married to Blythe in what is a major marriage of inconvenience, and I found it to be really interesting. And I will say that Eris really grew on me. There's a bit of a slow burn, and I wouldn't necessarily say they're enemies to lovers. There's some sort of weird enemies, but they're married to lovers, and it's a very interesting dynamic. I didn't really like the plot line that kind of happened with the family. Like I said, I don't want to say too much and spoil anything. If you've read this book, you know what I mean. But overall, this book did make me like Blythe and Eris, because I definitely was not a fan of them to begin with. And if you haven't read the Belladonna series, I definitely recommend it. There is a small amount of spice in each book, and the first book, Belladonna, focuses on Cygna. The second book, Foxglove, focuses on both Cygna and Blythe, and then by the time we get to Wisteria, Blythe is the main character of the story. So if you haven't read them, I would definitely check them out. But I think there's a lot of intrigue, and I do kind of wish this book answered a bit more of the questions I had surrounding like the other entities, whatever they are, because we're introduced to a new one in this book, similar to Death and Fate, but we don't really get more, and I wanted more. But overall, it did wrap up fairly nicely, but we were robbed. Ending of this book, we were robbed. We needed 10 more pages, that's all I'm saying. The next book on the list is the first book in a series, with the second book also coming out later this year, and that is Phantasma by Kaylee Smith. If you watched or read my review of this book, you will know that I was in it for the vibes. This book is a little messy. It's a little messy. There are some parts of it that feel copy pasted from other books within this genre or near this genre. So it does have its faults. It's not perfect, but if you read it for the vibes, my dear, you are in for such a good time. But Phantasma focuses on our main character, Ophelia, whose mother is brutally murdered. And as if that wasn't enough, her and her sister Genevieve discover that they are losing their home, Grim Manor. And so what does Genevieve do? She runs to Phantasma, a deadly competition in which the winner is granted pretty much whatever they want. They're granted one wish, doesn't matter what it is. And so obviously Ophelia, being the eldest daughter, has to go get her. And while they're both in Phantasma, because they both can't see each other at first, they are in different groups within the trials. So Ophelia meets Blackwell, they strike up a deal, and while Ophelia is completing the trial so she can get to Genevieve, because I believe they have to wait until they reach the 7th floor or the 7th round of trials, it's been a minute, then all the competitors can convene together, but until then they're separated into their own groups. And Ophelia, aside from finding Genevieve, also really wants to find out what happened to her parents and unravel the mystery and history between her family and Phantasma. And I will say, it is an interesting story. It does get a little bit all over the place at some points, and for a deadly competition that's held by demons, it fell a little flat, if I'm being honest, and the trials were way too easy. I know Ophelia is a main character, and you can always, well, almost always, bank on the fact that the main character is not going to be killed off in their own story, but we couldn't have roughed her up a little bit. But overall, this book was extremely spicy. Do not read this at work, and do not read this in public if you cannot hide your facial expressions, because sometimes it went there, okay? But honestly, if I think about how much I enjoyed reading it, because I genuinely enjoyed reading it, I can look past all of the other faults within the characters and the plot, because it vibed. The vibes were immaculate. The vibes were immaculate. Oh, God. The next book on the list is the last book on the list that I have a physical copy of, but it also might come as a bit of a surprise if you follow my bookish content, because I struggled with this one. And that one is A Feather So Black by Lyra Celine. This is also the first book in its series. I believe it's the Fair Folk. Yes, the Fair Folk series, this is the first book. And A Feather So Black centers around our main character, who is a changeling who was left in the crib of the princess when the fairies took the princess and left Fia. She's pretty much been raised as a princess adjacent character. The queen acknowledges her and treats her fairly well, but Fia is also constantly living in the shadow of the princess. She knows that she's never going to measure up, she's never going to be good enough, she's never going to have anything that the princess would have were the princess around. And so once Fia is older, the queen tasks Fia with going to fetch the princess from the Feylands. And this is where the book gets interesting. Because let me tell you, the first 30-ish% was a struggle bus. It was hard. I had to push. I almost DNF'd it. Once Cynthia goes into the Feylands, things start to really, really, really get interesting. And I know a lot of people have compared Rhys Tamlin dynamic, but I don't see it that way. I think that these characters are uniquely their own, and to diminish them down to Rhys and Tamlin level comparisons just isn't fair and isn't right. There's also a lot of magic and lore in this book. I thought it was very interesting, the twist with the princess. I kind of saw coming just because she'd been there for so long, but take it with a grain of salt. I don't always see things coming. I tend to get wrapped up in the now of the plot, and I don't usually think that far ahead. But by the time I finished this book, I kind of had a little ache in my chest because I was sad that it was over. And if I'm having a little ache in my chest because I finished a book, I think that means it deserves to go on my favorites list. Even though I struggled to get into it, even though I cannot stand the queen and her little sidekick, even though the Tamlin-esque character was Tamlin just a little bit, I really enjoyed this story. Once it got going and once I got into it, I found that I could not put this book down, and it is quite spicier than I thought it was going to be. So I would also keep that in mind too, just if you're gonna read it at work or in the public, just know that there's some spice in here. And next up on the list is The Everqueen by L.J. Andrews, and this is bear with me for a moment while I break this down. So the Everseas is a trilogy. There's the Everking, the Everqueen, and the Mist Thief. The Everking and the Everqueen are a duology focused on Eric and Livia. The Mist Thief is a side story but fits into the Everseas world, so I think that's why the author made it the third book, but it works. So the third book focuses on Jonas, who is Livia's cousin, and his story, which the events follow what happens in the second book, The Everqueen. Hope it made sense to you. If it didn't, please leave me a comment. I will explain it further in the comments for you. But in The Everqueen, Eric and Livia are reeling from a devastating betrayal. They are discovering new islands and lands. We're introduced to new characters. And both Eric and Livia really have to come to their own in this book. And I think that's what I like so much. It's that even though they are a pair, they still have to face their own battles on their own. They still have to get through the things they have to get through and fight their own demons, so to speak. And that's something that I actually really liked about this book, because I didn't want Livia to step in for Eric. And they do, at the end of the book, get there happily ever after, and everything wraps up very nicely for them. I do like that despite the fact that what happened at the end of the Everking, they were able to pretty much defeat their enemies, win the battle, and live happily ever after, if we're just wrapping it up. But I was also kind of sad to see the end of Eric and Livia's story. I would definitely recommend that you read The Everking and The Everqueen before you read The Mist Thief, just because there's so much that happens, and there's a lot of lore, and if you go into The Mist Thief first, just because it's not focused on Eric and Livia, I think you're going to be confused, because a lot of what happens in The Mist Thief is because of what happened in The Everqueen. So it's kind of hard to talk about one book without talking about all of the books, so I do apologize, but I genuinely enjoyed The Everqueen, and I wanted to add it to this list. If you haven't picked up the Eversea series, please take this as your sign. So if you thought the Eversea series was a little bit dysfunctional and all over the place, wait till I talk about the Legends of Thezmarr series by Helen Schurer. So in 2024, I read all 4 books in the Legends of Thezmarr series. And of all 4 books, I only really liked 3 of them. And that was book 1, Blood and Steel, book 3, Fates and Furies, and book 4, Shadow and Storms. I wasn't really a fan of the second book just because it falls into the trap of there wasn't enough spice in the first book, so let's just jam pack all the spice in the second book, and I just didn't like it. It felt like the spice just overpowered the plot, and it was just too much. So for that reason, I just couldn't add it to my favorites list. The first book, Blood and Steel, is a very good introduction to the Legends of Thezmarr. We meet Thea, who has 3 years to live. She's training at Thezmarr because she wants to be a warrior of Thezmarr. And we then are introduced to her future mentor Wilder, and they have this very interesting dynamic with each other. But there's also this darkness looming over Thezmarr and the kingdom as a whole, and there's a lot of lore with Thea's past that kind of gets revealed over the 4 books, which was very interesting. I actually really liked Thea's backstory. And so Blood and Steel just does a fantastic job of setting that world up. If we skip over all the smut in the second book and we get to the third book, Fate and Furies, Thea really comes into her own in this book, and I think that's why this book is probably my favorite next to Blood and Steel, just because of Thea's character arc. By this point, Thea's been through so much. I also don't really want to say exactly what she's been through without spoiling the first two books, but she's been through so much and she's finally at a point where she's really coming into the person that she's always wanted to be. It almost feels like when you work so hard on self-improvement and you finally step into that version of yourself that you've been dying to be for so long. That's what I felt for Thea, and I was just so incredibly proud of her. That's the best way that I can describe it. And then going into the fourth book, it kind of made me wish that this had been a trilogy instead of a 4-book series, because here's the thing. If you haven't read Slaying the Shadow Prince, which is about Wilder's mentor Talamir Starling, then you're gonna get a lot of spoilers, like I did in the fourth book. And I didn't want to hit pause Slaying the Shadow Prince because I was so invested in the Legends of Thezmarr, but I kind of wish I had, because now I have no desire to read Slaying the Shadow Prince because I know pretty much exactly everything that happens. So just a little warning, but things do wrap up fairly quickly, and I do like that Iron and Embers, which is also set in the Legends of Thezmarr world, is going to focus on Thea's sister Ren, which I'm very excited for. Our alchemist turned assassin. Kind of love that for her, but but this series was very good, and please don't let me put you off to the second book, because I would say that this series is very much worth reading, and if I was going to recommend a reading order, I would read Blood and Steel. I would read the first 3 books in order, but then before you read the fourth book, I would read Slaying the Shadow Prince, just because you do get a glimpse at younger Wilder, but you also get to know Talamir and his story before the fourth book, where you have all of these characters together. I didn't do that, and so I ruined Slaying the Shadow Prince for myself. I'm not gonna lie, I thought I had another book on the list, but no, we have made it to the end. Those were my favorite reads of 2024. I'm really leaning into the fantasy romance genre. I think at first I didn't want to go all in. I was very against picking a niche. It's like, I like to read fiction. That's the niche. But the truth is that I've been reading a lot of fantasy romance and I just can't deny it any longer. So a lot of what I plan to read in 2025 will be fantasy romance, and there will probably be a few other genres mixed in because I do like a good historical romance and I do like a good murder mystery and psychological thriller. To be honest though, if you have any recommendations for good domestic psychological thrillers, please send them my way, because I love a good domestic psychological thriller. But with all that being said, if you've also read any of the books on this list, I would love to hear your thoughts about them, or if you've been thinking about reading them, or maybe you did read them and you didn't like them, I'd still like to hear your thoughts on them. But for the most part, that's all I've got. I can't believe I really thought I had another book on the list. I feel kind of silly right now. But I did also just want to say thank you for your patience. I know I've been a little bit MIA. It's kind of the same thing that happened over the summer, where life just got to be a little bit too much and I just had to step away. But in case you didn't see my community tab post, I'm going to be temporarily reducing my upload schedule to about twice a month. And if I have a video that's ready, then I'll throw it up. But I'm essentially anticipating posting every other Friday at this rate, just because I did start a second blog and I want to continue monetizing the first. So between those two, I just have a lot going on. Between 2 blogs, a day job, and a YouTube channel, there's a lot. I'm a little busy. So I am going to be reducing my upload schedule for the moment, but this isn't permanent. And as soon as I have more time freed up to focus on YouTube, I will be back to posting once every week. And I do also want to lean a little bit more into the book content this year. I still want to post vlogs, but I'm thinking the majority of my content will be book videos, mostly around fantasy romance and fantasy genre. So if you're into that, then please stick around. We are almost at 100 subscribers. Last time I checked my subscriber count, I was at 99, which is wild, especially because I haven't actively been posting. But yeah, we're at 99. And that's just like nuts. I can't believe we're about to hit 100. So if I've hit 100 when this is posted, and if not, then we're almost there. We're staying positive. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for not giving up on me, because I don't want to be one of those new YouTubers who you start to get invested in and then they disappear off the face of the earth, because growing a YouTube channel is really hard. But thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye.